Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Pulitzer's Convening sessions on biodiversity and forest issues in Southeast Asia. It's me, Dyna Rochmyaningsih, a freelance science journalist and the executive director of the Society of Indonesian Science Journalists, who is going to moderate the session in the next 1.5 hours. So before I start the session, I would like to read some logistical stuff that Nora and Mas Hari shared to me. So the first is please be sure to join the computer audio and enable your microphone and cameras if you're prompted, and this may depend on the session. So if you or a colleague is having trouble accessing the video or audio, so please get in touch with Leonor or Nora. And second, if you have any questions or comments throughout the session, please do not hesitate to submit these through the Q&A and chat feature of the Zoom window that appears at the event platform, or you can also use Pitloop event or direct chat features, and someone from the Pulitzer team will make sure the message reach the presenters. And you can also raise your hand if you want to directly ask questions to us. All of our sessions in the convening meeting have simultaneous translation available between English and Bahasa Indonesia. So please select your preferred language by clicking the interpretation icon on the Zoom or stream window and send us a message if you need help. So finally, we will record all sessions in both languages and post them to Pitloop within 24 hours after the session ends. So thank you very much for your attention. Now we can start with the session. So, ladies and gentlemen, we know that Southeast Asia, both the mainland and the islands, are home to the world's mega biodiversity hotspots. But we are now also know that we are racing against time to protect it from various threats such as deforestation for monoculture plantations, as well as infrastructure development. And we know that these stories of forests and biodiversity loss are also the stories of human loss. Zoonosis, which starts the loss of human lives that we are experiencing right now, land grabbing in indigenous land, are all human stories that we journalists have to cover. And many of these stories are hidden and underreported, especially in Southeast Asia. So to gain more knowledge and perspectives on the matter, we are here today to listen to a comprehensive presentation about the situation of forests and biodiversity in our region. So please welcome Dr. Ding-Li Yong. Dr. Ding-Li Yong coordinates Birdlife International's work on migratory bird conservation in Asia, and he works closely with Birdlife's NGO partners in Asia on projects focused on species and wetland protection, and also work for international organizations such as the Arctic Council, IUCN, and the Asian Development Bank. And Dr. Ding-Li completed his PhD at the Australian National University, where he studied ecology of birds and various insects. He has also worked widely across the region, particularly in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And he also writes a lot about this issue in Southeast Asia. And I think he's a very right source when we talk about biodiversity in Southeast Asia. So yeah, before I give the screen to Dr. Ding-Li, I think I will tell you first that we're going to make today's presentation into two parts. The first part is 20 minutes presentation from Dr. Ding-Li, and followed by the Q&A, and then we'll go to the second part, another 20 minutes presentation, and we'll go to the second Q&A. So I think that will work for both the participants and the panelists. So Dr. Ding-Li, I think I'll give the floor or the screen to you, please.
Thank you very much, Dina. That was a very comprehensive introduction. Really appreciate that. And of course, once again, on behalf of BirdLife International, I'm really grateful to Pulitzer Center for hosting this event and inviting me to share a little bit of my knowledge and what I've learned from working on biodiversity conservation in the last 5, 6 years of my career. As Dina has mentioned, I have structured my presentation in such a way whereby it'll be broken into two parts. And in between, we'll have a little bit of a conversation and talk about some of these issues I've raised. The first part of my presentation will talk a little bit about the background of biodiversity to give you a better understanding of how we see biodiversity through the lens of scientists. And of course, I want to give you a really, really quick journey through Southeast Asia's biodiversity to give you that showcase of how much unique species and ecosystems we have in this part of the world. And then, of course, I will conclude this session, first part of this session, with a little bit of a visit of the threats that biodiversity face in this region. Many of you probably are already familiar with these threats through your journalism work. I hope to add a little bit more of these recent insights from studies by my colleagues that would hopefully stir up some interest and hopefully inspiration for you to do more work reporting on these issues in the region. So what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to do a share screen, and I know my computer always has this tendency to be a bit laggy. So if you see me not responding, it's because the computer is taking that 3 to 5 seconds to flash that screen up. So I am going to click on my share screen button right now. All right. Okay, I think you would see my PowerPoint on your screen. And I'm going to turn it into presentation mode. Okay. Okay, sorry, I think it shared at one of the later slides, so I just took a few steps backward. So my presentation is here to give you a bit of update, insights, and also help you to interpret biodiversity better. But I think for a start, I think it's very good for us all here on this call to get a better sense of how we typically see biodiversity as ecologists, as researchers. What are the angles, what are the framing that ecologists use when we talk about biodiversity, and how do we talk about biodiversity? I think for a start, and for the benefit of some of you who are still fairly new to reporting on ecology and biodiversity, I just want to quickly how we find biodiversity, how we look at different units of biodiversity. So typically when we look at biodiversity, we tend to go down to the scale of the species, but the species presents with us with only some perspectives of how we interpret biodiversity. So we sometimes move up this hierarchy, a ladder of different lenses in which we look at biodiversity. And I think this little diagram here that I've shown you on the right side of my slide shows you nicely that hierarchy in the way we think about biodiversity, in the way we talk about biodiversity, and in the way we conduct research on biodiversity. So from the smallest end of this scale, we tend to look at things from the organismic perspective. But as you move slowly up this sliding lens, you look at organisms to the level of populations, and then onward to the level of the species, the biome. So whenever you look at research papers, books on biodiversity, we tend to talk about things at these different scales. And four of the most common lenses which we ecologists like to look at biodiversity is from the lens of populations, populations within a species. So within one species, you may have populations spread out in different parts of where they are found. So for example, for the case of something like orangutans, when we talk about orangutans in Borneo, you have orangutans in northern Borneo, there are populations in northern Borneo, in the Malaysian part of Borneo, you have populations in southern Borneo, central Borneo, and so on and so forth. We also look at biodiversity from the perspective of communities. So when we talk about communities, we are talking about many species together and how these different species fit together into an assemblage within a habitat in which these species are found. And of course, as we move one more rung up this ladder, we also look at biodiversity from the level of ecosystems, which is fairly broad and takes into consideration both the living things that live within that system. So to speak, the biotic factor, as well as the non-living things within the system, which are we tend to refer to them as the abiotic factors. I think this slide probably needs not too much introduction, because this is a slide that many of you are very familiar with, but I think Southeast Asia has some of the most remarkable quantities of biodiversity in the world. For those of you who are not aware of this concept of biodiversity hotspots, many years ago, ecologists tried to understand where are these main concentrations of biodiversity around the planet. And they went to look into list of species of different groups of animals, birds, mammals, reptiles, and all that, plants, of course, included, and try to look at the world in a big picture point of view to understand where are the places we need to prioritize biodiversity. So I think it comes quite clear to us that Southeast Asia is obviously one of the key areas for species richness in many different ways. If you look at this map very carefully, a lot of ecologists and biologists, we tend to break Southeast Asia into 4 units. These units go beyond the political breakdowns of different political units like countries. We tend to think of mainland Southeast Asia as one big unit, which we call Indo-Burma, and of course includes countries from Myanmar to the southern parts of China. A very rich area for biodiversity, as I must say, and new species are constantly being discovered. And then moving south of Indo-Burma, coming to a part of Southeast Asia that we are probably a little bit more familiar with, because many of us are based here, is this region called Sundaland. And Sundaland is remarkably rich in biodiversity as well. It is straddling the equator, so obviously you expect to see huge areas of equatorial tropical rainforests here, and overlapping with some of the most species-rich units of land in the world. You've got the Malay Peninsula, you've got Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, and together Sundaland supports more than 500 to 600 types of mammals and many more that we probably don't even know at this point. And then, of course, we've got the Philippines. Philippines a little bit further away from mainland Asia, but still remarkably important for biodiversity. Perhaps the Philippines may not have as many species as the mainland parts of Southeast Asia, but the Philippines is remarkable for supporting some of the most highest levels of endemic species in the region. So on many of the islands that you visit in the Philippines, you are likely to find plants, animals that are likely to be confined to a very small part of the island, or perhaps a very small part of the Philippines and found nowhere else in the world. And the same can be said for this part of Southeast Asia we call Wallacea. Wallacea sits right at the southeastern corner of Southeast Asia, where Indonesia transits into the faunas of the Pacific and Australasian region. Wallacea, as you can see from my map, is made up of lots and lots of islands, 7,000 islands in total, but dominated by some of the biggest and most complex islands in the world, like Sulawesi, which I've had the honor of working in the last 10 years. Remarkable, levels of endemism, like the Philippines as well. And also, of course, lots of species that we don't know at this point. So putting things into perspective, Southeast Asia is remarkably rich in many different fronts, but you can see that in my exploration of biodiversity in Southeast Asia, 2 themes keep coming up. 1, it is very rich in species. 2, it is also very rich in species that are unique to this part of the world. And for many of these smaller organisms like insects, frogs, and fish, the more we study, the more species we find, and many of these eventually turn out to be restricted to very small parts of Southeast Asia. Of course, I want to go also one level up. I've talked a little bit about the species, but I want to move to the level of ecosystems and biomes. So what are these kinds of biophysical environments we have in Southeast Asia? Quickly looking at the map that I've shared with you here on the right panel of my screen, you can see that the color on my map is mostly light green and dark brown, and you can match that to the legend, basically saying that these are tropical rainforests. And as this map shows, there's a lot of forest cover in Southeast Asia. Of course, much of that is lost, but within this broader cover of forest, there's a lot of diversity across different kinds of forest cover you're seeing. Even though this map here may not show you that diversity and variation in the different kinds of forests, in much of places like Borneo, in the lowlands, we have lots of what we call lowland dipterocarp forests, which many of us are very familiar with. Those of you working to cover stories on the ground in Borneo, for example, or in Sumatra, you are often confronted with stories on, biodiversity loss in lowland forests, and some of the really charismatic species that we have in this part of the world, which I'll talk about very soon, are also found in lowland forests. But perhaps what is not so well demonstrated by this map is that there's also a lot of different other kinds of forest types, such as montane forests. As we go up into the uplands of Southeast Asia, above 600 meters, you start to see a transition of lowland forests into other kinds of forests that are really quite different in terms of the kinds of plants you find in them. We call them montane forests. And montane forests, even within montane forests, there's a remarkable amount of diversity from the far northern reaches of Southeast Asia, which is very close to China. And these montane forests have many species that are very much shared with the Himalayas in China. And these forests, when you compare them to the montane forests, for example, in the Philippines or in Indonesia, they don't share that many species. So like I say, the devil is in the details. It looks like Southeast Asia is covered with one generally similar piece of forest, but that is not true. There's a lot of diversity amongst the forest types we can see in the forest cover of Southeast Asia. And that's not all. I have not even gone into other kinds of ecosystems. I've not even talked about wetlands and grasslands. Maybe some of you are not so familiar with these habitats because they don't feature so much in ecology stories or biodiversity stories, but we do have some of these really important areas of what we call dry forest and savanna in little patches in Indochina. So looking at more closely at this dark brown patch here, if you look at the map, it says subtropical dry forest. It's a really complex biome or set of different ecosystems here, which include some open savannas, that are somewhat more reminiscent of what you will see in Africa. This kind of ecosystems also reappear in the eastern part of Indonesia, in the Nusa Tenggara region, as well as for those of you who have been to eastern parts of Java, you will see very similar dry ecosystems dominated by monsoonal forests in national parks such as Baluran or Meru Betiri. So early on, I talked about species. Now I talk about biomes. And for both cases, we see a large amount of diversity, richness, and endemism. I share with you one image I've taken from some of my work in the region. This is from a tropical lowland rainforest in Peninsular Malaysia, which amongst ecosystems in Southeast Asia supports some of the highest amount of plant diversity and large vertebrate diversity. Moving on to the animals, I've talked a little bit about the big picture things. I've talked about the ecosystems, but I also want you to know a little bit about the animals that we have in this region. Maybe I don't have to go into that much of a detail because many of these animals that you're going to see here are familiar. I'll start off by talking a bit about the charismatic species, the species that you see on the front pages of magazines, wildlife books. Two of the most charismatic species that are really shaping the way we think about biodiversity in this part of the world. Many of these species are vertebrates, and two of these examples is the tiger, of which is represented by many subspecies in Southeast Asia, and obviously apex predator, a species that sits right on the top of the, so a species that are very important in shaping the entire ecosystem because it preys on so many other different animals below it in the ecosystem. On the right side of the my panel here, I have this bird here that maybe some of you are more familiar than others. This is not the prettiest of bird in Southeast Asia, but to me personally, as a bird conservationist, this is one of the most majestic birds I've ever seen in the wild in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, even though it's quite widespread in our region, it's surprisingly rare. I've only seen it once in my career and heard it a few more times in the jungles of Malaysia, Indonesia. Yeah, this is none other than the helmeted hornbill, and it's one of the species that is driving a lot of conservation efforts for hornbills in this region, partly because of the threats it faces, and also partly because, like the tiger, the helmeted hornbill has very, very large spatial requirements. So to protect a species like the helmeted hornbill, you need to protect large areas of rainforest to keep their populations in good health. These are just really charismatic species at the tip of the iceberg. I don't have the time probably to talk about too many other species, but I'm sure you are familiar with the orangutans, of which we have 2 species, in fact 3, because our colleagues recently discovered a 3rd species in the region of northwestern Sumatra. We call this region Batang Toru. So we've got 3 species of orangutan, which is one of the headline species for conservation in Southeast Asia, as well as the Asian elephant. You have read about. I also want to go a little bit into the species that we don't talk a lot about. There are species that we tend to spend a lot of our time talking about in scientific papers, in the newspapers, but there are a lot of species that are very important to our Southeast Asian ecosystems that we tend to overlook. And I just want to give them a little bit of limelight on my presentation here. I think some of you might probably know what I'm going to talk about next. I want to bring you to the kingdom of Insecta. The insects are really amongst the richest group of organisms in Southeast Asia. And I've deliberately changed the backdrop on my slide to reflect on one of the most diverse groups of insects in the world. These are the beetles. Beetles are in terms of species richness, they dominate insects. I think for every 4 or 5 species of insects known from the planet, one of these would be a beetle. And what is surprising and probably something that Southeast Asian ecologists can be proud of is that Southeast Asia itself is really at the heart of beetle diversity on the planet for many different beetle groups. Just for one quick example here, I'm sharing with you here a little graph that shows the breakdown of one particularly well-known group of beetles in the world. These are the tiger beetles. They are quite conspicuous. I think you can see them in most parts of the world. But if you look at the map, you see where the bars are the highest. It goes right into this region called the Oriental region, which is where we are here in Southeast Asia. Why are these insects important? I mean, by virtue of the diversity, we also need to recognize that insects play huge amounts. They play a big ecological roles in our ecosystems, and these ecological roles, I think, are often not very well understood or well described, but they're nevertheless very important. A lot of us who write stories about insects or who have had the opportunity to look at insects more closely know that, for example, many species of insects on top of bees and butterflies perform pollination services for rainforest plants and plants in other biomes. And when these insects are gone, so are the very important ecosystem services they perform for the forest ecosystems they live in. So insects are a very, very important group of fauna that we don't talk a lot about in Southeast Asia. And I hope I can, get you guys to think a little bit more about insect diversity in this region. And of course, something that is really close to my heart, because this is a topic that I work on day in, day out in my work. I want to talk a little bit about species that move across the region, species that have very large spatial requirements and move at the continental scale. Up to this point, I've talked a lot about the ecosystems, the species that are found, in this region in Southeast Asia. I've not covered so much about the species that move at the ecosystem, at the continental level. And I want to draw your attention to migratory birds as well. I know migratory birds are not a particularly well-known element of the avifauna of Southeast Asia. So whenever we talk about birds in Southeast Asia, we tend to think about hornbills, colorful parrots found in Sulawesi, in Papua, and some of the pheasants that you get in Vietnam. These are the birds that people think of when they think about Southeast Asia, but not so many people out there are aware that our region is also very rich in different kinds of migratory birds. And we sit here right in the middle of this, what I call this huge avian flyway. We call it the East Asian Australasian flyway. And what it really is that it's a massive corridor used by more than 400 different kinds of migratory birds moving between Northern Asia to Southeast Asia and Australasia. So lots of these migratory birds, they pass through Southeast Asia on their journeys further south, but many more, in fact, the majority of these bird species, they spend their time, when winter hits the Northern Hemisphere, they come to Southeast Asia and they spend time in our rainforests, in our wetlands, and also contribute to the biodiversity of Southeast Asia. They cannot be forgotten in any kinds of discourse about Southeast Asian biodiversity. Now that I've given you a really brief overview, I wish I had more time to talk about biodiversity in general, because it's so nice to really visit different groups of species and tell you a little bit more about why they're important to our ecosystems. But I want to bring you to the heart of our conversation, which is biodiversity loss in this region. And I want to start off, by giving you a really quick snapshot of biodiversity decline in Southeast Asia, how serious it is at the global level, how serious it is at the Southeast Asian level, and then after this, talk a little bit about what are the threats that are driving biodiversity loss. I think being an ornithologist, I would tend to use more of bird examples, and sometimes I'll jump around to mammal examples, which I'm familiar with as well. But we could probably talk a little bit more about other groups of animals and plants during our Q&A. What I'm showing you on my chart here comes from the report that we publish every year. This is called the State of the World's Birds. And the State of the World's Bird is a document where BirdLife International has developed to monitor the conservation status of birds around the planet. Is the state of the world's birds getting better, or is it getting worse? I think the graphs, the statistics speak very clearly for themselves. On the right side of my panel here are the birds that are not threatened. So they are in these categories called least concern and near threatened. Least concern, or the birds that are not in any major suffering from any major conservation threat, you see that the numbers are going down. So why are the numbers going down? Obviously, these have to be offset by something else happening up this scale here. If you look at the bird species that are threatened, okay, of which we can classify into three broad categories. We've got species that are considered as vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. Over the past 2 or 3 years, bird species that fall into these three categories have gone up, which is not surprising, because this is it reflects on the generally deteriorating state of ecosystems around the world. At the same time, you also see that. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, you have 5 minutes more for the first
okay.
part.
No worries, no worries. Yeah. So I'll just accelerate a little bit through this. I think the charts speak for itself. The number of species that are threatened are really increasing. Species are also in decline across other species besides birds are in decline across different parts of Southeast Asia. And one of the species that I feel highlights or so-called headlines this decline really well is the decline of this very charismatic mammal called the Javan rhinoceros. It's a mammal that used to be found more widely across Southeast Asia. We now know that the only populations left of this majestic mammal is in the western part of Java Island. But once upon a time, and not even that long ago, maybe just 10, 12 years ago, there was a population that was known from Vietnam, but that population has now gone extinct. And I know maybe the Javan rhino is an exception, but it also represents a deteriorating state of biodiversity in this part of the world. Moving on to my next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what are the causes of biodiversity decline. And knowing well that my time is really limited, I will probably run through this pretty quickly. This is a diagram that many of you are familiar with, but what this diagram is telling us is that most, if not the vast majority of decline are really caused by people, and it's various activities that humans are doing on the ground that are accelerating the death, the loss of biodiversity. One of which is the loss of forests, loss of habitats, forest habitats across this region. I think we are all very familiar about forest loss in Southeast Asia, and forest loss, of course, is a very complex problem. Just quickly looking through the map that you can see here, you can see the green areas being areas that are current areas of forest, but a lot of those areas that are gray, the areas that are now devoid of forest, they used to be covered by forest. So looking from what we have in the present, and reflecting on the past, we can see that we've really lost a lot of forests in the last 20 to 30 years. But what's worse is that forest loss has not slowed down. It's continuing, and in many places in Southeast Asia, it is in fact accelerating. The loss of forest is, of course, a complex issue, and we cannot just simply look at it from the point of view of the reduced area of forest. As ecologists, we also tend to look at more complex components of forest loss, like how forests, as they get chopped down for timber and other uses, how do these forests get degraded? How do these forests shed and lose biodiversity over time? We also think about how forests get fragmented. As forests get fragmented, we know that there are certain synergies and events that happen that accelerate species loss within these little small patches of forest in the region. Forest loss, as we have traditionally known, tend to be largely in the lowlands of Southeast Asia, as you would have seen in the newspapers in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. But of course, forest loss is creeping slowly up our mountains. Nowadays, you can see that many areas of mountains in Southeast Asia, in places from Borneo to mainland Southeast Asia, we are seeing increased levels of deforestation. And I share with you some examples here from mainland Southeast Asia, from Thailand, whereby you can see that deforestation in the uplands have sped up in the years, driven in part by conversion of land for agriculture. I've talked a bit about forests, but of course we know that forests are not the only ecosystems. Other ecosystems in this region are not spared from the impacts of man as well. Wetlands are in trouble. Mangrove forests are amongst the most familiar examples of wetlands in Southeast Asia, and mangrove forests have been hammered all across the region. We have seen spectacular levels of mangrove forest loss all across the region, in large part driven by expansion in fish farms, shrimp ponds, and also in many parts of Southeast Asia, the loss of mangrove forests have been driven by conversion of land to monoculture and other forms of agriculture. So the picture is not at all looking good across this region, not just for forests, but also for wetlands. I've talked about loss of wetlands and forests, but I want to delve a little bit into how species are affected individually before we go into the Q&A. But really quick on this one. While we are seeing loss of forests and wetlands, we also need to be mindful of the fact that species are taken out of our ecosystems as fast as the forests are being, chopped down or converted into other land uses. And the take of species is driven largely by two major motivations. I think for many of us in Southeast Asia, especially our friends in Indonesia, you're probably well aware of the trade in birds for the pet bird trade, because of the popularity of keeping birds as pets, and in various singing contests across these parts of Southeast Asia. So lots of species have been affected in this way, and I show you one example of a species. This is the Javan pied starling. Is one of those species that have suffered massive declines. I think at last count, it is probably functionally extinct. There are no more individuals left in the wild that can allow it to survive in the short term. But this is just at the tip of the iceberg. Many other bird species are affected this way. Then I want to draw your attention to species loss because of bushmeat demand. In many rural parts of Southeast Asia, local people have taken, for various reasons, to consume bushmeat. And especially communities that are, impoverished, living near to protected areas or major areas of forest. Often bushmeat offers easier sources of protein, cheaper sources of protein that they are unable to obtain, elsewhere. So bushmeat has been a really big threat to our biodiversity and has caused this whole phenomena we tend to refer to as defaunation, whereby entire assemblages of mammals and birds are wiped out from forests because of unsustainable hunting take of birds and mammals. These two figures.
Yeah, so I think we'll start the first Q&A.
No problem. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but
not at all. Yeah.
It's a really great introductions to biodiversity in Southeast Asia, and you begin to introduce us to the threats and how problematic all these issues are. So yeah, at first, we have some questions here, and the first questions is about the migratory species, and this is something that really interests me in your presentation. So someone is asking, I'm wondering if you can share any examples of success stories or challenges of transnational cooperation for conserving these species. So is there any academic or policy or something, frameworks that are interesting to approach this cross-border issue? So is there any collaboration in conserving these species?
I think migratory species or the whole concept of conserving migratory species is still relatively new in Southeast Asia. We've only begun to think about this more recently and to think about how we can collaborate across borders. Unfortunately, I'm unable to provide you with a success story. I don't think it exists at this point because a lot of the work is still quite new. And I hope that in 5 to 10 years from now, we have some good examples to tell you. But just moving a little bit north of Southeast Asia, moving into the East Asian region, there are examples of bird species that have, made a comeback because of protracted effort by stakeholders in different countries to work together to protect them. I think one of these species is, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the water bird species in this region, but the species is called the one of the rarest migratory waterbirds in Asia, for that matter. This species comes marginally to Southeast Asia, but most of this population can be found in Korea, China, and the northern reaches of Vietnam. In the 1990s, there were less than 1,000 individuals left, but thanks to protracted work to protect wetlands in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, I think this species has made a remarkable comeback. I think at last count, which is based on the census that many of my colleagues were involved with just about 5-6 months ago, the last count was about more than 5,000 individuals. So that's a change, a 5-fold increase in its population in the last 20 years, thanks to improved collaboration, improved monitoring, and improved work on the ground to secure some of these key wetland sites the species depend on. In Southeast Asia, we hope that the work that we're currently doing for species like the spoon-billed sandpiper, a really threatened shorebird that is largely found in Myanmar and Thailand, would be able to make a comeback. The population of this species is currently less than 500 individuals.
Wow. Interesting. So do you think this infrastructure development affect their navigation? Is there any kind of study?
I think the key threat posed by infrastructure development, which we can see is increasing across all regions of Southeast Asia, is that it drives direct habitat loss. And I'm not sure how it will affect their migrations, but the way I see things right now, the main threat to them is the loss of the habitat that they would need to use when they are spending their winters here in Southeast Asia. I'll give you an example from Indonesia. I think in Sumatra's coastline is one of the most important parts of Asia for migratory waterbirds. But as we see right now, Sumatra is undergoing rapid development. There's a lot of monocultures coming up. There's also plans for major infrastructural developments on the Sumatran coastline. There are plans for ports to move palm oil to ships. There are plans for ports to move coal and all that. And some of these plans overlap with areas that are important for migratory birds. So in the long run, I would see that these infrastructural development would lead to direct habitat loss for species, many species of shorebirds. Same goes for other parts of Southeast Asia. Yeah.
So yeah, so the Sumatra coastlines are important. Okay.
Yeah.
So the second question is about the charismatic species versus less charismatic species. You mentioned insects, right? So Tatiani from Indonesia, she asked, many parties focus on large fauna like tigers, orangutans, elephants, and in your opinion, why is that so? And is it related to funds or what? And do you think that the plant species, they get less attention to these conservation initiatives as well?
I think that's a really good point that our colleague has raised. There is obviously, as conservation biologists and conservationists, we tend to think a lot about how much resources we are spending on species and ecosystems. And I tend to have a lot of these conversations with my friends, trying to look at, how many dollars are we spending on average for this animal species versus other species. And I think it's quite clear cut that the investments in terms of the resources that we put on elephants, tigers, hornbills, rhinos are quite a lot. The reasons for them, I can see two reasons. I think the first reason is that from the conservationist point of view, they see these species as high-profile species that the public is able to relate to easily. And they see that if we invest in conserving these species, we can we can continue to secure that interest and support from the public. So I think that's a valid point of view. The second point of view from the scientific perspective is that a lot of these charismatic species, they need large areas of forest. I mean, let's talk about orang-utans in Borneo or Sumatra, or Sumatran tigers, or Indo-Chinese tiger. To sustain a population of tigers, for example, you need to protect large areas of forest. So from the scientific point of view, it is also reasonable for us to consider large animals such as these examples I mentioned, because they will drive the protection of large areas of forest, which in turn will secure the habitat for so many other species that share the same habitat as the tigers. So the birds, the plants, the insects, and all of that. Yeah. So that's still also, to me, a perfectly valid argument for the way we spend our conservation resources on charismatic species. But I feel that recognizing how much more important insects are, for example, and some plants are, and how little, I think there's also a need for us to rethink how we allocate resources to ensure that our colleagues working to protect lesser known species, insects, plants are there as well. Yeah, I think there's a need to level off some of that imbalance in conservation resourcing for species and ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers the question. Yeah, but this is a good question, and I can probably go on this for hours. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I will go for one other questions, and then we'll go straight to your presentation. So
no problem.
So we can answer the other questions in the second Q&A session. So the last questions for this part is from Shilin in Makaranga. So she asks, is there enough coverage of ecosystems, biomes, and biospheres, whether at nationally or regionally, and is that important?
I feel that I feel that there's still a lot of scope for work for us to report on ecosystems and conservation stories at the regional level and at the national level. I think if you look at things from the global level, I think a lot of there are not so many conservation stories coming out from Southeast Asia, except from for stories focusing on a few groups of charismatic species. So I think there's definitely a lot more work that we can do, to ensure that in the global conservation discourse, species from Southeast Asia, ecosystems from Southeast Asia are better represented. At the national level, within the countries of Southeast Asia, I think there has been a growing interest from many of our journalist colleagues to do stories on biodiversity loss or biodiversity in general, but I think the scope is still there for us to increase our reporting and coverage of many of these species. I think the public still have a lot to learn about biodiversity in Southeast Asia, and I think more stories of this would be important in helping to create the public discourse and drive the public support that conservation is working on the ground, working to protect tigers, whether tigers, birds, or trees, or carbon. We need this awareness as that backing, the awareness to trigger interest to donate to conservation initiatives around the region. I think the journalist fraternity is in a very powerful position, to drive that interest in biodiversity and conservation in our region. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Dingley. So we still have 3 other questions that haven't been answered.
We could take one more if you like. Yeah.
So we'll go to your presentation first.
No worries.
Yeah, we'll have more time in the next Q&A. So in this second presentation, so it's only 15 minutes. So you can choose which one is important. So
no problem. No problem. Yeah. So I'm just going to quickly run us through some of my last few slides from the earlier segment of my presentation. We've talked about biodiversity loss, and we know that hunting is a really big issue for biodiversity in Southeast Asia. The maps obviously shows this very clearly, and based on studies on the ground, we know that many local communities, in the way they exploit resources, are driving up the demand for wildlife meat and all that, and showing obviously that hunting is a major threat to our biodiversity. I think we have made it really clear to us that if we continue lose species and plants in our rainforest, and there would be long-term consequences. Depend on these ecosystems for a lot of the services they provide us. Everything from non-timber forest products to water sources and all that. So that, I hope, explains why biodiversity loss through hunting is a major issue for us to think about. And one thing that I've not covered, and probably quite appropriate for me to quickly run through this, is that that we create when we diversity that we don't often think about, and the current pandemic that we are currently in clearly reflects this. I think we've gone through a few pandemics or epidemics in the last 10-20 years, and in many cases we find that outbreaks of these diseases, zoonotic diseases, tend to come when biodiversity has been lost, or when you come into situations whereby human beings come in closer and closer proximity to nature, through deforestation or loss of wetlands and other things. So I think zoonotic diseases and the emergences of new viruses should be a very, very pressing reason why we should care and think about biodiversity loss, not just in the short term, but in the long run as well. And of course, now that I've talked about biodiversity loss, I want to quickly explain a little bit about the conditions that facilitate biodiversity loss. I know I've not that much time, but I'll just quickly run through why we need to think about biodiversity loss from the conditions that enable biodiversity to be lost in the first place. I would like to talk quickly about governance. In Southeast Asia, governance is a major issue that we think about a lot, because governance at various levels of society regulates the way we access resources in our ecosystems. It regulates the way we are able to share and make economic use of these resources. In our region, we know that governance is not strong in many cases. There are numerous examples that I'm sure you're very familiar with, whereby there are governance leakages due to corruption or other kinds of regulatory issues. And of course, coming to the heart of the problem, we also think about problems of governance, such as lack of clarity on who owns the land and who can access those resources available on the land, and whether, if those communities on the land have the power to do something about the future of the land that they think they own. So governance issues are a very important part of biodiversity conversations. We must continue talking about them and recognize these problems caused by weak governance to how we can better protect our nature. And of course, sitting right at the bottom of governance issues, there are also issues of poverty. I think in many different parts of Southeast Asia, there are numerous case studies and examples to show that there's a very clear-cut link between impoverishment of local communities and how this would have compromised the livelihood opportunities for local people, and how this create problems for conservation, because local people are forced with little options but to tap onto accessing biodiversity resources to make up for lost income or other kinds of absent opportunities for their livelihoods. So I know this brings us to a rather grim part of my presentation, talking about all the problems we face in biodiversity conservation in Southeast Asia. And also, recognizing how complex and how difficult to solve these problems we have in this region. I want to also bring us back to a more positive note that as we face these problems, there are also other challenges that we face in the region in relation to biodiversity conservation that we don't often think about. We know that we have a lot of biodiversity in this region, but we also know that there is still a lot more that we don't know about. And in the past 10-20 years, every time you look into research papers, you will find that new species are being discovered from this part of the world. Species that are thought to be, to have even gone missing for a long time, such as this example of the black brow babbler in a study that was involved in recently. This bird was thought to be missing since in the 1850s, and it was, rediscovered after such a long hiatus in the remote part of Kalimantan. So in spite of all the, while recognizing all the different threats that we have, our biodiversity is facing, we also have other challenges in relation to how much we know about the species that we have in this part of the world. New species are constantly being discovered and rediscovered. And then, of course, there are also entire ecosystems that we don't tend to think a lot about, and therefore they get missed out from the biodiversity discourse. Many of such ecosystems are poorly studied, and fortunately for some examples, more and more of our colleagues are working to better understand these ecosystems, but there are still large gaps in knowledge on these ecosystems. One of the examples I want to bring to attention is limestone ecosystems in Southeast Asia. We tend to think a lot about tropical rainforest, but we tend not to think a lot about forest, whether we are on mainland Southeast Asia, as you can see on the map I have here, or in parts of Sumatra and Borneo. So there's still a lot that we can learn about our biodiversity and our ecosystems in this part of the world. Other challenges that we face in this region, also things that I need to talk about. Other challenges that we face includes, the gaps in protecting our biodiversity. We have created more and more protected areas to protect our biodiversity, but some of the most important questions conservationists are asking is, are our protected areas good enough? Protected areas are the mainstay of conservation in this region, but the questions that we need to think about, and obviously our problems that we face in this region, are these protected areas performing? Are they well designed? Are they connected to each other to allow species to move around? And are they well managed in general? Do we have the manpower, the resourcing, to run and manage these protected areas for biodiversity, as well as catering to the needs of local people and other aspects of livelihoods, resulting from, say, tourism, ecotourism. Yeah. So protected area management is a big issue for conservation in Southeast Asia. It's something that we have to think about because they are such an important part of what we have left with us to secure the remaining biodiversity in this region. Yeah. And of course, last but not least, I know I've talked a lot about the immediate threats that biodiversity has been facing, but I do not want us all to forget that in the long run, in the long term, there are also other looming threats that we must not forget, and that is the issue of climate change, human-driven climate change. Climate change obviously will be a major issue for years to come. I think all around the world, we are beginning to see that climate change is causing entire species communities to shift. And even in Southeast Asia, we notice from studies over the last few years that there have been shifts in species distributions arising from climate change. Climate change will be expected to cause a lot of changes in our ecosystems and biodiversity. How will they change them? How will they weaken them? I think these are very pressing issues that scientists will have to look at. And of course, we need to have a better understanding of how climate change, drive biodiversity loss and degradation for us to take action to protect our biodiversity better. With that said, talking about climate change, talking about gaps in our protected areas, I want to move on to a little bit. I want to move to a more positive note on talking a little bit about what we can do for conservation. What are the actions that we can take, and how can we scale up these actions for the long-term maintenance of our remarkably rich biodiversity here in Southeast Asia? And the way we see it, the way many conservationists will see it, is that we need to look at problems from a spectrum, from the local scale to the global scale. At the local scale, I think I've mentioned a couple of times that local people are at the heart of many of our biodiversity issues in the region, and local people must be engaged and empowered in how they would relate to their biodiversity, how they would relate to the kind of resources they access from the forests or the wetlands that they live around, and how can they play a bigger role in helping to conserve these ecosystems. We need to create platforms, we need to create systems and mechanisms to get these local people involved, more engaged, and also knowing, how their actions would cause biodiversity to be affected, and how they have the power, they have the rights to make these things better. Also on the topic of protected areas, moving one level up that rung. We've talked about local communities, moving on to the level of what governments can do. Governments can do a lot, of course, because governments form one of the most important part of the puzzle in protecting our nature in this region. Governments have a big role to play, for example, in terms of how they can take more action and allocate more resources to protect our protected areas. We have, national parks, nature reserves across Southeast Asia. There's a lot of work that our governments can do, and of course with support from other experts, NGOs, and local people as well, to better manage our protected areas, to make sure that these protected areas are protecting the species that they are supposed to protect. And of course, governments working to protect these national parks reserve can work better with local people to ensure that there are local engagement on the ground to patrol these areas and to ensure that regulations enforcement are followed. And of course, moving on, yes.
Just a reminder that you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, sounds good. I think I'm on track. Yeah, I think I'm on track. Yeah, so I'm slowly moving up this ladder on the different lenses that we can see conservation action on the ground in Southeast Asia, from the local to the global. So I've talked about how local people can play a part. I talked about how governments can play a part at the national level through strengthening our protected area network and working also with local people and NGOs. But moving up to the level at the international playing at the international level, international multilateral agreements, of which we have many, have a major role to play in ensuring the protection of our nature by providing the enabling conditions for us to develop policies, regulations to manage biodiversity. I think some of the best known of these multilateral agreements that many of you would have maybe reported on would be things like the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is one of the most important pieces of international legislation that convenes governments from around the world together to think of solutions to deal with shared environmental problems. And of course, that's not all. We have multilateral agreements to convene governments to work together on wetlands as well. For those of us working on wetlands, we are probably aware of the Ramsar Convention. It's a major piece of international policy where governments work together to identify and protect the most important areas of wetlands in their countries for biodiversity and for local people to use in a sustainable manner. So putting things into perspective, three big ways where we can do better to protect biodiversity. We can work more with local people to empower them, to engage them at the level of the country, at the level of national governments. There needs to be more work that needs to be done to help our protected areas, to strengthen them, to manage them better. And then at the international level, we need to work closer together as amongst countries to deal with shared conservation issues. I of course want to also remind everybody here that moving into the 21st century conservation, we are faced with some shifts in paradigms. We have new tools at our hands to help us to collect biodiversity data, and this is really important because having this evidence-based approach by protecting biodiversity allows us to design the best possible interventions and management approaches to conserve our forests and our wetlands. So many new tools are emerging. For those of us who cover stories on science, we know that some of these tools, such as acoustic sensors, genomics, drone technology that have emerged in the last 5, 10, 20 years have changed the way, the interface at which we can collect more data at higher resolution, which will allow us to make decisions to protect biodiversity. This can probably take up a whole presentation on its own, but I'll just quickly run you through how science and technology is changing the way we collect data and therefore changing the way we protect biodiversity. And to end it up, to sum up my presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about my organization, share with you a little bit about what Birdlife International does, how we arrange our programmatic priorities to look into the world's most pressing conservation issues. We have 9 major programs in Birdlife, and each of these programs were designed and crafted to look and engage with some of the most pressing conservation issues in the world. I probably won't have time to go through each and every one of them, but we obviously recognize that forests are important, climate change is important. We also need to think about conservation at the level of the site and habitats. And of course, even though we tend to look at these things at in bits and pieces, there are lots of synergies across them that teams working to deal with climate change, teams working to deal with forests and site conservation can work together to synergize their engagement to these conservation problems. In Southeast Asia, we have a number of projects, working with our BirdLife partners on the ground to conserve forests, some of the most important areas of forests for biodiversity and also for the services these forests provide for us. This is just to give you a snapshot of the sites that we're currently working in, and like I say, this is not comprehensive. There are other sites that we work on the ground as well to secure the conservation of these rainforests. For wetland conservation, it's something that is really important to our partners in Southeast Asia. We work with more than 8 or 9 different partners to protect wetlands through a variety of different ways. I want to share with you quickly the example of Thailand. In Thailand, we work with our BirdLife partner in Thailand to secure land. We recently were able to work with our partner to acquire an area of wetland where we are now working closely with the local people to restore this wetland for biodiversity and at the same time explore ways where we can create opportunities for livelihoods. Some of these wetlands are still active areas of salt production. We are working with local people how they can manage these salt producing areas to ensure that they can make money from the salt and at the same time protect migratory birds. So this wetland in Thailand called Pak Thale is one of the examples I really like to highlight. Yeah, and I think with that I really sum up my presentation. I think there's a few key messages I want to share with the community. These measures summarized here in 6 points. Biodiversity loss in Southeast Asia is a very major issue. It's very severe. We have seen it in species going extinct, many species suffering from deteriorating statuses, and forests are being lost at a rapid pace. We know that a lot of habitat loss in terms of our wetlands and forests are due to land use conversions for agriculture. As much as habitats are lost, we also know that the wildlife that are found in our forests and our wetlands are being unsustainably taken out for various uses by people. And although these are the short-term drivers of biodiversity loss, there are also long-term impacts in terms of the losses of ecosystem services these sites will suffer. As we all know, conservation of our ecosystems is not a simple thing. There are complex issues of governance. There are complex issues of how communities and local people are involved, and try to solve these issues would be critical to strengthening the way we protect biodiversity. But last and not least, of course, is that to protect our biodiversity in this region, we need to strengthen conservation at all levels, from the level of local people all the way to the level of international cooperation, as you have seen in my examples of CBD, the Ramsar Convention, as well as other platforms, say through the ASEAN framework, to drive collaboration at the regional level, at the international level on shared biodiversity issues. So I think that pretty much brings my presentation to a conclusion. Thanks very much for hosting, Dyna.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Dingley. Such a very comprehensive presentation in 30 minutes. So thank you very much for that. And we'll still have questions, and because we will have another session that will start in 30 minutes. So we only have 10 minutes for our Q&A right now. So I will just read the rest of the questions in the first part. So this is from Audrey in Singapore. So she's asking, is there any data that shows how loss of biodiversity due to hunting or agroforestry is impacting how forest functions? She says that she has a study in the Amazon that shows that the deforestation is affecting forest ability to cycle water. So in Southeast Asia, is there any study of it?
I think a lot of the examples that we've looked at in the past are from tropical Africa and from the South America. But I'm aware of a few studies, from colleagues working on large mammals, looking at how the loss of large mammals trigger changes in the ecological community of a forest. When you take out a large predator, for example, it will change the abundances of animals that the large predator eat. and that also drives other, what we call trophic cascades. Such studies are also available for Southeast Asia. I think there are such studies in Malaysia. There are colleagues of ours looking at seed dispersal. Seed dispersal is a really big topic because, I mean, at the end of the day, many of these trees grow up from seeds. So there are colleagues working to understand how the loss of large mammals, large birds like hornbills and pigeons will compromise seed dispersal. These studies are in place. Perhaps some of them are already published, and they show that, when we lose some of these large birds and mammals, the long-term regeneration and recruitment of many forest trees are compromised. And when those trees are compromised, there would be other repercussions on not just the ecosystem, but also on the people who access resources in those forests. I'm happy to have a conversation with our colleague to look more into these studies. Yeah, but they surely exist in Borneo, in Peninsular Malaysia, certainly in Sumatra, as well as in western forest areas of Thailand, where there's been a lot of studies on large mammal communities.
Okay, so yeah, so maybe the next questions is related to this seed dispersal study. Yeah, so Han Yuan Leong, I hope I pronounced it right. So from Malaysia, so he asked, or he or she, sorry, he asked that, is it possible for reforested areas to have the same biodiversity as virgin forest? Is there such kind of thing happening? What do you think?
I think it is very, in short, okay, if I have to say in 2 sentences, the short answer is no. Yeah, I think once forests have been disturbed, there will be a long-term change, a long time to come. There have been studies that show that some of these forests which are thought to have been virgin, in different parts of the tropics in Africa and in South America, are actually disturbed hundreds of years ago. And even after hundreds of years, there's still that indication that these forests were disturbed a long time ago. So once you disturb a forest through logging or from other forms of degradation, there will be some changes in the species that are found there. They will take a really long time to change back to the original state, or species that are lost, if there are no surrounding populations of those species, they cannot recolonize these forests. So
to protect them, right?
Yeah, so I think as a conservationist, and if I'm asked to think about how we can better protect these forests for species and ecosystem services, the standard answer is to, based on the latest science and based on the what we know about species distributions and how resilient they are to logging and deforestation, is to protect as large as possible an area of forest or wetland. And as far as we can, try to make sure that these areas of forests or wetlands are connected to others. Connection is connectivity, and this is important because you need to have these little corridors where species can move in between, where forests have lost species, populations from other surrounding patches can recolonize those forests. And they can only do that if the connectivity is there. If the connectivity is lost, then the species cannot come back again. Yeah. There's a lot of studies that look at forest bird communities, dung beetle communities, butterfly communities in virgin forests, log forests, twice log forests degraded by burning. Lots of such studies, and the studies have given us a very clear understanding of how human driven degradation would change the biotic composition of these forest areas. Yeah, lots of examples from Indonesia, Malaysia, and also some emerging studies from the Philippines. Yeah.
So talking about this thing, reforestation, we know people start talking about solutions right now. Okay, so we have this already deforested areas, and then for example, in oil palm industry, so some people try to make the sustainable level of oil palm, and then some of these companies like secure some areas, and then they make like something like secondary forest. I mean, okay, they have this forest, but it doesn't function like primary forests that have grown millions of years or thousands of years. So do you think this kind of forest, they still function to conserve some species? And do you think that's it's okay for conservationists to say, oh, okay, so they make this effort, and this is the solution.
One of the professors that really influenced me in terms of how I think about biodiversity is that he portrayed the entire concept of saving the biodiversity as shopping. We are actually shopping for biodiversity. We are trying to keep as much as we can. If I can, if the conservation community could, we'll of course try to prioritize on virgin forests. But that is not to say that degraded forests are useless. Degraded forests still have a lot of role to play. Degraded forests, as shown by numerous studies, they can still sequester a lot of carbon. So a degraded forest is better than monoculture or something else that is quite monotonous. So degraded forests have a role to play in maintaining some of these ecosystem services. And there are also instances whereby degraded forests in Southeast Asia continue to support some rare species or important populations of rare species. One good example comes to mind. There's one case study from East Kalimantan in Kutai Timur Regency. There's this wetland called Masangat. With a few colleagues, but this is interesting because Kutai Timor, a large part of it has been, deforested and converted into oil palm. Oil palm failed because the soil is too waterlogged, But a lot of new biodiversity surveys by colleagues I know working there have found that these areas are still used by threatened species of crocodiles, threatened species of birds. So what I'm really saying is that yes, primary forest, virgin forest is important, and we should try to keep as much of them connected a way as we can, but we cannot overlook the value of degraded systems. We should try to find ways to restore them if we can, and connect them with other patches to increase their resilience to other stresses. So short answer is we should also care about degraded forests and wetlands because they provide opportunities for restoration.
So yeah, one last question, Mr. Deng Li. This one is from Chris Belson in Maluku, Indonesia. He asks, animals such as kuskus are hunted and are threatened with extinction due to customary events of indigenous people in eastern Indonesia, especially in Seram Island. So how can we prevent it from happening? How could conservationists, deal with this sensitive cultural issue in conservation?
This is a really good question. I really like to thank your colleague for raising this question because this is something I wanted to talk a little bit more about, but couldn't find the time to do it just now. But thanks for raising this question. Yeah, I think one of the interesting topics that we are looking at in conservation in Southeast Asia is traditions, local traditions, and how local people access biodiversity. In this case, your example of Maluku communities, harvesting couscous, probably the same done in Papua, or Halmahera, I don't know. Yeah, but it's a really important thing for us to think about. We know in many cases, local people hunt biodiversity for local consumption. The good thing about local communities hunting is that they are usually at a very low volume, so it's never at the level of industrial level exploitation. But I think we need to find ways, in how we engage these people to, in cases where species are in danger of extinction, we need to find ways to engage local people and to see if there are alternatives for local people. Are there other species they could hunt? They are less threatened. Are there other alternatives of animals that they could use and therefore offset the pressure threats faced by the species that is threatened? I think these are things that we need to talk about. Fortunately, I think for couscous in Seram, I think it's couscous is probably still quite common in tropical rainforest in Maluku, but there are actually some really good examples across other parts of tropical Asia whereby this problem has surfaced. We have in parts of Indochina, in parts of Borneo, in parts of eastern India, near to the border of Myanmar, local people hunt for hornbills, hornbills for their feathers, and the feathers are used in a lot of ceremonial gatherings and rituals. So question is, how can we encourage local people to think about the conservation of hornbills as much as we recognize their right to access natural resources to harvest feathers, for example? I think there are some instances of success stories whereby people have provided alternatives, viable alternatives, but after lots of engagement with local communities to explain to them, to demonstrate the impact on hornbills. I think there's a case study from Borneo whereby local communities are persuaded not to use hornbill feathers for these rituals, and they are now encouraged to use synthetic feathers, which are now a viable replacement. So that kind of reduced the pressure from hunting faced by hornbills in this particular part of Borneo. I think it's in Sarawak. Yeah. So I think local engagement is key. And if the situation is really dire for the species, there needs to be exploration of alternatives or creation of alternative livelihoods for these local people. I think there's a few more examples I want to talk about, but I don't know how much time you've got. There's another
Yeah. So yeah,
yeah.
Actually there's another question from Nora. I just read
Sounds
it. So
good.
it's related with this, collaborating with the indigenous people for conversations, and she's asking for examples. So I think we can you can keep in touch and then talk more about it. And yeah, we'll follow up via email. And so yeah, I think this is the end of our session. It's been a very wonderful session, and I'd really like to thank Dr. Dingley for his time. And for participants, thank you very much for the wonderful questions. We'll meet again tomorrow in the journalist session. So I think I will end this session.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And yeah, have a good day, have a good night, sorry. So yeah, we'll meet again tomorrow. So bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for hosting. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.